Thanks everybody for joining us tonight, and thanks in particular, of course, to Patrick Laurie, who's our speaker. We're really delighted to welcome him. I know we were just talking, but Susanna is a big fan, I think, both of Patrick, both as a writer and as a conservation farmer as well. So Patrick's joining us as the second part, really, of our themed sort of curlew conservation set of discussions following on from Friday night. And Patrick's here to share his perspectives as a farmer and as a champion for wading conservation, both on his farm, but also further afield now. And of course, the challenges of bringing those two things together. I think he probably won't describe himself as this, but maybe a bit of a role model for those of us trying to achieve the same outcomes around Morecambe Bay. Patrick, for your benefit, there are quite a few people here tonight on the call who are, trying really hard at the moment to conserve and keep the curlew nests going around the bay. So locating them, letting us know about them, and then helping in efforts to keep them from either being destroyed by predators or from things like the silage cuts that we mentioned earlier on. So I think you'll have some people here who are not just keen to listen, but actually keen to learn to influence the efforts that they're undertaking. And there'll be people here, from the farming community around Morecambe Bay as well, particularly on the Cumbria side, who are as committed as you are, I think, to what we're trying to achieve. So we'll say a little bit more about that, and obviously we'll have an opportunity to for you all to ask questions later on in the talk. I'm Tom Burdett. I'm the chair of Morecambe Bay Partnership. We have a few colleagues here as well tonight. So Susanna, I think most of you know, is our chief executive, and Amy manages our nature programs. And they're both leading on the curlew work, and obviously other wildlife projects and farmer engagement projects that we work on at Morecambe Bay Partnership. We also have Claire, who's our archaeologist, but also our digital whiz as well. And Morecambe Bay Partnership, as you all know, we're a small charity, but we work right the way across the bay from Barrow to Fleetwood, creating the Bay Cycleway and delivering a load of programs through nature and natural heritage, archaeology, arts, beach cleans, oral history, storytelling, and access projects around the bay. As I said before, this is the kind of the second in our themed talks on wading bird conservation in particular. We are, as you all know, internationally significant for our wading birds. Yes, in winter, the second most important wading bird site in England with 200,000 birds, but obviously really vital breeding habitat as well. Although we know how much they're in serious decline, really struggling. So many of these obviously are breeding birds within farmland, and I think we're really keen, really excited to welcome Patrick, because we're involved here in really trying to make sure that farmers are seen as part of the solution, the crucial role that the farming community have. Sometimes can maybe be wrongly portrayed as the villains, which of course we know is just not the case. Patrick will explain a lot more about that and the difficulties and challenges, and the passion, obviously, that the love of the land that only farming can bring, can bring to this area of work. I mentioned earlier that lots of you are kind of running around frantically at the moment trying to locate curlew nests, and even since we spoke on Friday, a couple more nests have been identified, and I know that a lot of you are carrying on, trying to locate them and get them fenced to protect those nests. We raised nearly £500 on Friday and we will be opening the donation link on the chat feed again, so look out for that through this evening. As we said on Friday, the donations for this work are absolutely vital because we don't have any external funding for this work. So whether it is helping us with the fencing to get the nest fenced, or whether it is helping us with cameras, both to kind of monitor the nests, but also to broaden our engagement with the project, it is absolutely vital. So we'll say a little bit more about that at the end of the talk as well. But to Patrick. So Patrick Laurie runs a small farm in the Galloway Hills near Dalbeattie. He's quite amusing, actually, on the fact that it's Galloway rather than this kind of modern Dumfries and Galloway. I found that quite amusing reading that. And he's preoccupied by farming, particularly cattle farming, great lover of the Galloway breed, but also is involved in grouse management, wading bird conservation, and both works literally in that field, but also writes about it. So his blog, we're going to put a link to that, the Galloway Farm blog, is incredibly popular. It's full of his stories of birds and cattle and his efforts to work on his farm for wildlife, but also there are kind of hints and links to the wider work that he does in sort of upland hill farming conservation projects across southern Scotland and the north of England. So we'll put that link to his blog in the chat feed. The other thing as well is his book, which I've just started reading, called Native. Hopefully you can see that. It is lovely. I've just been reading it. It's very, very beautifully written, and so it's not a massive surprise that it was shortlisted for the Wainwright Prize for nature writing. And it also made its way into the Times and Sunday Times Nature Books of the Year last year. Patrick was just explaining to us that his tours kind of promoting the book, just as it was taking off, were slightly and painfully cut short by lockdown last year. So it's brilliant that not only, Patrick, are you able to join us, but we're also able to maybe help you get back on the get back touring and talking and promoting about your work and your writing. So we'll ask you some more questions about that at the end. I think we're all really looking forward to hearing from you. So I will be quiet now and hand over to you. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Tom. That's brilliant. Can you hear me? That's I'm live.
Very well.
So thank you. Yeah, no, that's probably a far bigger fanfare than I really earned. But this topic of curlews, we've talked about curlews already a bit this evening. This topic of waders and ground nesting birds and conservation more generally is such a huge big part of everything that I do and work on. Actually, I found it quite difficult looking ahead to this talk to actually be able to pin it down to one particular subject. And I suppose I was slightly idle in that I've chosen to particularly focus on a piece of work that I'm involved with through a project in Scotland at the moment called Working for Waders. Not just because it's something that I've been working on just recently, but also because it's really blown the top off my understanding of wader conservation, ground nesting bird conservation, and managing land, managing predators, managing really tough decisions around competing land uses. This Working for Waders project that I've been involved in over the last few weeks, a couple of months, has really put a whole new slant on lots of that. And I think probably to start, a bit of background on the Working for Waders project. The Working for Waders project appeared in Scotland about 4 years ago, and it came out of a much bigger project called Understanding Predation, which was commissioned by the Scottish Government to try and really get down to the bottom of some of the issues we were having in terms of conflict between different interests in different land uses. And actually, specifically, it was based around some aspects of raptor persecution, gamekeepers and raptor persecution. But more generally, it really looked at the kind of disparity you get between the people who work on the ground and see stuff day to day versus scientists and ecologists who are often taking a very different angle at taking a very different perspective on some of the same issues. And it was always that kind of logjam experience of basically, to paraphrase it heavily, scientists saying, why don't you listen to us? And farmers saying, well, why don't you come up with something we can actually do, rather than complete sort of hocus pocus ideas. So much seemed to stem from that kind of just disconnect, this communication disconnect, that seemed to apply to waders, that working for waders was kind of born more as a collaboration project than anything, an opportunity to get organizations, individuals, a whole range of different people. And that's right from farmers through to conservationists, through to ecologists, through to people from all different backgrounds, to really start focusing in on wader conservation. And so Scotland's in a slightly different place to England. The publicity and the momentum and the excitement that's been gathering around curlews, specifically in England over the last few years, is interesting in Scotland, because we're not in such a desperate situation nationally. We're not in such a desperate situation as you are. We're not quite there yet. So I think working for waders took a broader look at a number of different wading bird species, including oystercatchers, including lapwings and curlews, and also golden plover and redshank, and took just a broader look at all those species. And I suppose 4 years into the project, we're starting to regret that slightly, because as we're getting into some of the really fine detail about some of these species, we realize actually waders is such a madly confusing, disparate group of birds. They don't really sit together at all. What's right for one of them is absolutely the wrong thing for the other. So it's a bit of a clumsy term. So what we've done over the last few years, we've worked on, so I've been involved in working for waders I went straight from understanding predation into working for waders, given that I originally trained as a gamekeeper, and then I did lots of work, moorland management advisory work, working with grouse moors, a number of big grouse moors, and I still work with a number of big grouse moors now on their wader conservation work. We've looked at mapping projects, identifying hotspots for waders. We've held engagement meetings for farmers. We run seminars and published guidance, and just generally tried to join the dots and work out where stuff wasn't working. And actually, one of the things, I'm going to try and be really concise with this, because I've got loads of stuff that I'd love to talk about, and I really also want to hear what people say afterwards. I really want to hear some comments. But one of the problems that was really obvious, and working for waders kind of hadn't necessarily set out to address, but it turned out that was a really important thing, is loads of people are doing the same stuff, and unless there's one organization that you can plug into to see who's doing what, actually there's a huge amount of wasted effort. The amount of times when we sat in meetings and said, what we want to do is produce, say, guidance for people who are managing grassland for lapwings, there's like 30 people have done that in the last 10 years. Wherever you turn, you get management but until you produce that inventory, until you actually sit down and work out who's done what, in a way, we almost don't need more guidance. What we need is better targeted guidance, and we need people to really work out where this kind of stuff should be going. So that's just kind of an example of working for waders, trying to fill the gaps and trying to plug holes. This year in particular, we had a private donation, which allowed us to buy 25 Nest cameras, which were distributed across Scotland throughout March, and a whole load of different land holdings, all the way from Shetland down to me. I'm the southernmost in Galloway. But people who are interested in curlew conservation, oystercatcher conservation, actually oystercatchers are a funny one, because it's rather a hard sell to get people interested in oystercatchers. Oystercatchers appear to be the most incredibly abundant birds. But when I saw a statistic recently to say 40% decline since the mid-90s and no sign of an uptick, oystercatchers are not a million miles away from curlews. The frustrating thing is that they actually do really well in towns, and they do really well on roundabouts and on the roof of KFC. And so generally, when you're trying to describe to people what waders are, they generally say, oh, I know what an oystercatcher is. And then it's quite difficult to then say, yeah, that bird that you see hundreds of all over the place all the time, yeah, we need to worry about that bird, because that's kind of like a counterintuitive message to get across. So working for waders, I think, as we all do, no matter what country you're in, I think we're all really conscious that waders are declining because of a drop in productivity. We've got birds that aren't producing replacement chicks. So the bottleneck, the real issue we're getting, is this time of year, actually breeding failures just adding up. And I think that's a pattern across most wader species, but it's specifically relevant for curlews, which has been a big part of my work over the last probably 10, 15 years. So working for waders at the same time, recognizing this, but also balancing on one hand, a lot of gamekeepers and a lot of farmers who have a very clear understanding that predators are driving a lot of these declines, balancing those voices with other voices saying that things are maybe a bit more complicated, and actually quite a lot of it's to do with habitat. Because I think no matter where you stand in terms of predator control, I think one of the things, really encouraging things that's come out over the last 10 years is actually it doesn't feel as controversial as it did anymore. Predator control doesn't feel that controversial anymore. We're not arguing about whether or not it's the right thing or the wrong thing to do anymore. I think we're almost past that moral argument, and I think it certainly feels to me anyway that we're now talking about how best to do it and how to be targeted and how to be clever with it. And we're not necessarily arguing about resurrecting sort of Victorian gamekeeping models where anything that's got teeth or a aggressive attitude is consigned to the bin. It's about being more clinical and being more clever with what we're doing with predator control. So, trying to balance those two things. We embarked on this project with the nest cameras, and we really wanted to get to the bottom of what's happening at wader nests. I had a bit of a personal interest in this because here in Galloway we have got stacks of badgers, absolutely stacks of badgers, and it's very difficult to mobilize conversations about badgers without really noisy complaint. Like it is very difficult to talk objectively about badgers, and yet if I say that it's not, for a while I was saying that I reckoned that our badgers here outnumbered our foxes by a factor of 5 to 1. I actually think it's more than that now. I think we're more than 5 badgers to every fox, which starts to make me feel like predator control is a bit redundant, because if you can manage your fox numbers and take care of your crows, all you're effectively doing is creating more food to feed the badgers, which you can't do anything about. So from my perspective, I really wanted to get into this and find out more about it. And so we sent out the nest cameras, and I was really keen to get curlews because I'm very interested in curlews here. We have very, very few curlews in Galloway after a time when we had a huge number of curlews here. 1960s, 1970s, incredible densities of curlews here, and then which was immediately followed by massive, to a level that is almost incomprehensible to people outside Galloway, massive level of commercial forestry plantation. We're talking hundreds of square miles of forestry, which was planted in the 70s and 80s and is still being planted today on curlew habitat as well. Transformational land change here. I really wanted to get cameras onto some curlew nests and find out what the actual mechanisms look like, because I was really aware we had really bad productivity. Our curlews basically never fledged any chicks for the entire time I've been interested in curlews. 10, 15 years, I've seen 2, maybe 3 chicks ever fledge, and that's out of hundreds of breeding attempts. So we're just completely flatlining, and I really wanted to get into a bit more detail of why. So also, I probably have to put in the disclaimer as well, say that everybody had a different take on the project. So I was particularly looking at badgers, but everybody was looking at different angles of this. And actually, that's the best thing about working for waders, is that we're not really a led group. So I can say, I think this. I can sort of wear a working for waders hat, but also quite happily speak my mind on it. It's not, there's no party line to this. But the first thing that immediately struck to me is I started to pay much more attention, knowing that there were waders around, knowing that there were nest cameras to be set out. I started to pay a lot more attention to what was going around, and I found what I think probably is 2 of the last lapwing nests for probably 10 or 15 miles in any direction around them. So these incredibly lonely, isolated birds are working away in a very heavily commercial managed silage field. It just so happens there's a drain burst in the middle of it and a lovely wader scrape that you almost couldn't have designed if you'd spent a fortune getting a digger out to dig it for you. It was absolutely pristine lapwing habitat. So first things first, I got a camera onto one of those nests. And in short order, a communications failure with the farmer meant that slurry was spread that night on the field. And it wasn't just a slurry spreader, the traditional slurry spreader, it was umbilical slurry spreading, which has really, really got going here over the last few years. You could not design a more efficient way of destroying every nest, every living creature in a field by hauling a hose over the top of it full of slurry that not even, well, some of the fields around here now, particularly this is big dairy country, Galloway, not many people know a huge amount about Galloway, but Galloway provides over half of Scotland's milk. We've gone really, really intensive in terms of our grass, and we're actually only a tiny part of the country. There are 8 1,000 cow dairies in Scotland, 1,000 plus cow dairies in Scotland, and they're all in Galloway. So all of our best ground, all of our best traditional lowland curlew ground has gone to really, really high octane commercial grassland management. And actually, farmers are now buying not cuttable ground, but next to cuttable ground, simply because they have to have something to spread slurry on. And actually, when you see the extent that slurry is being put on, it's extraordinary that SEPA, that there's no bells being rung about this. And in the push to create bigger fields, we've now got, even near here, one field of 120 acres and another field of 100 acres that's just ryegrass. And the problems those farmers now have is that the hoses, when they're spreading slurry, are so heavy that the tractors won't pull them. So this is at a level of intensification that kind of defies imagination when you're outside Galloway. People imagine, I suppose, if anybody has any association with Galloway, they'd maybe imagine that it was a quiet little rocky backwater in a little forgotten corner of Scotland. Absolutely not. There's some serious commercial investment that's gone in here over the last 10-15 years, and as a result, our curlews and lapwings, and to some extent oystercatchers too, are absolutely through the floor. So in trying to be succinct about this, because inevitably I tend towards havering, I managed to get good communications going with the farmer. I then found another nest, lapwing's nest. I marked it, and then trying to find the contractor to make sure that it wouldn't then be rolled, so that he'd know what the red markers that I put out were, so that the nest wouldn't be rolled. I went through a lot of rigmarole. I'd always thought that agricultural damage was like a bit of a side story, like a bit of like a oh, that was a bit careless, come on, do better next time. Actually, the more I started to look into this, I was thinking, wow, this is the systematic destruction of birds' nests across massive areas, and not just across peripheral habitats. I mean, birds want to breed in productive places, and we want productive places for ourselves. I mean, this is an inherent logistical collision of minds here. It was really difficult to find which contractor was doing it. The boy wasn't always there. He was only doing it as a favor to his mate, so he could only come some weekends. I couldn't get a number for him. I couldn't find out when he was going to come and do it. I had to put up a sign to say, please mind out for the red thing, and then at the same time be ready when the phone rang to make sure that I could rush out, because it's only a few miles away. I think probably you get the impression, an unsustainable level of intervention for the sake of a single lapwing's nest. Anyway, the field was rolled, all because, let's be clear then, an unsustainable level of intervention for the sake of a single lapwing's nest, but all had stemmed from me having put a camera out. So immediately, the camera hadn't caught any predation, it hadn't caught any other difficulties. All it did was basically say, wow, look at the intensity of this kind of landscape. It really kind of forced me to tune in to a lapwing's eye view. The field was rolled and the nest was saved. I was every day expecting a badger to come. There's a huge density of badgers in the area. Every day expecting a badger to come. And in a way, I mean, this comes up with some other stuff that I'd like to talk about later. And actually, I'd like to ask you generally about you as an audience about this. It was difficult to work out what I should do, understanding that ground predators were the main threat. Should I fence off the nest and protect it? Or, for the sake of this project, this national project that's trying to develop narratives about what's happening to wading birds and trying to get under the skin of it, should I almost let it happen for the sake of recording it, so that I can then feed into a bigger conversation about? Because that's then, I was really interested that the camera that's currently gone live, I was watching it the other day for curlew country. That's brilliant. There's people all across the world watching that, but that nest has got a fence around it. And I don't feel hugely strongly one way. I don't have no evangelical point here, but I almost wonder how valuable that is as an educational tool if you're almost giving a lopsidedly positive presentation. Say, here's this curlew nest, here are the chicks, fantastic. Is it not then slightly difficult to kind of retrofit the message to say, actually, by the way, what you've just seen there basically never happens? And actually, for the sake of narrative, for the sake of bringing people along with the journey, I don't know. I'm in a quandary. I'm not leading this one way or another. I'm in a quandary as to whether or not you let it happen or whether or not you intervene. And I understand that the situation in England, this is specifically a conversation I had within working for waders earlier today, was that you're in dire straits. You're fighting for every single pair, so you almost can't afford to make that point in a way that perhaps we can in Scotland. And so I'm kind of going through a similar dilemma with oystercatchers at the moment. Every year that nest gets eaten out by badgers. This year I've got a camera. It would take me 10 minutes. I've got all the kit in the back of the truck. I could just put a fence around it and make sure the badgers don't get it. But at the same time, there's part of me, kind of the whole thing. I hope what I'm trying to do is give you an idea of how many hairs start running from this kind of project. Is say then I bring protect those oystercatcher chicks. They hatch out. They go off into the wild, and a badger eats them. And then I haven't got them on camera, and they didn't produce anything anyway. So there's so many different angles to play this, and the Nest Camera project, I suppose, really started to spark my interest. Really start thinking about this, because also, even when you go back to slurry and looking at applications of slurry, I was aware of slurry. My farm doesn't produce slurry. All my cattle are outdoors, but I hadn't realised there's a huge impact in terms of chemical impact on the soil biology, which actually often drives lots of worms, lots of the invertebrates that waders need much deeper down into the soil for the immediate aftermath. So it's almost like a poisoning effect. So even if, say, you protect your eggs, you're effectively destroying the field's ability to provide for the waders. So, and I am part deliberately touching all kinds of different things here because I want to convey the fact that this is way more complicated than me effectively going, oh, I'm going to finally get a picture of a badger eating an oystercatcher. That'll teach it. Alongside it, a complete curveball fell into my lap. I was walking with a friend up in the Galloway Hills, and I found a golden plover's nest. Golden plover are staggeringly unheard of rare here. We used to have huge numbers of them. But they are generally recognized as the first bird to leave when commercial forestry comes in. Within 4 or 5 years, commercial golden plover is absolutely gone. They won't tolerate that kind of management. That's not just the trees, but also the associated grazing impacts. So there's less grazing, so the vegetation's taller, so the plovers just absolutely don't like it. I asked a local RSPB guy. He said he reckoned that there were probably less than 6 breeding pairs of golden plover in Galloway, and certainly no records in the last 20 years. So the fact that I found no confirmed records, the fact that I found this nest was complete fluke. I'd love to make out that I'm some sort of Ray Mears character creeping amongst the scree. Literally, it got up at my feet, and it was sort of fluttering sideways. And I thought, yeah, you don't think you're injured. I mean, you're making out you're injured, but I don't think you're injured. Anyway, sure enough, there was the nest with 4 eggs. So I've got a camera up on that. Actually, I just have to see. We did a dry run before. I can't resist it because it is the best thing that has ever happened to anybody, and I can't. That's not just hyperbole. It is genuinely the best thing that's ever happened to anybody. I got this photograph on a trail camera the night I set the trail camera up. Is that going to work? So this came through. This is a satellite-enabled camera. Can you see that? Is there a nod to say that you can see that?
Yeah, I think we can see that. It's an amazing image.
Yeah, it's really cool. And so the nest is just beyond the male bird there. And the day I went up, I didn't realize it looked lovely, fresh day. By the time I got up to the top, there was about 8 inches of snow. And obviously I didn't want to disturb the bird, and I stepped in the wrong place anyway. Got up from under the snow and was back within 15 minutes. But just what a place, what a bird, what an experience. I'm so enjoying this. This is just the best thing ever. And fine, that's my little indulgence. But I suppose the golden plover raised a general question about nests and about monitoring nests. Well, there is a slightly more philosophical question about setting cameras at nests, because the general consensus has quite often been that by setting a camera at a nest, you're going to actually attract predators to that nest. It's going to become a bit of a focal point. And we were quite cautious about that. We didn't want to necessarily be sending out cameras across Scotland and then almost like dooming these nests by hanging cameras in front of them. But working with BTO, we did a bit of a literature review on it. And yeah, so predators respond to Nest cameras, but it's not always negative. There's no rule of thumb to it, and different species respond differently. So even when I was testing the cameras and setting them up, I wanted to there's a telegraph pole over the river down below me here, and I know, because I've seen them when I've been out lamping, foxes run along that telegraph pole at night time. And I thought it'll be quite a good thing just to test it. I set up the trail camera, and sure enough, middle of the first night, a fox comes along the telegraph pole, and it sees the camera, and there's a lot of this going on, and it's sort of like can't quite see what it is, and then it doesn't like it, and it buggers off the other way. And the next night, it does the same, and it keeps doing the same until finally it gets the courage, and then it just quickly ducks past. Foxes from these cameras and badgers from these cameras hate them, really hate them, really won't go near them. And I know there's lots of different types of cameras, and cameras work on lots of different ways. But it was quite interesting to say that these cameras, by being shiny, might be more appealing to corvids and might be more appealing to stoats and weasels. So there was no overall evidence to suggest that predation was increased as a result of having the cameras. But it was almost like if you were less likely to get raided by a fox, you might be more likely to be raided by a crow. And actually the balance still, nobody has a definitive word on this, but we were quite interested. We're keeping an eye on it as we go. We're now 8 weeks into this project. It turns out that getting predation on camera at a nest is bloody really difficult. And actually we've had like three nest actual predation events. And one of them is a crow. One of them is a fox who walks into the back corner of the screen, and he looks at the camera as if to really rub it in. He looks at the camera, and then he takes a curlew egg and goes away. And the feeling is that he's often been back and forth there, and he's finally got used to the camera. But the camera had been there for some time, so it's a really interesting kind of point, and actually quite a fun thing to play back to some of the ecologists who are working on this project. The ecologists who started out saying gamekeepers are always blaming predators for driving the declines of ground nesting birds, and where's the evidence, and we only work on evidence, and this is all just supposition, and we only work on evidence. When they were given cameras, quite a lot of them wouldn't set them up near nests because they were worried about predation. And now we've just done a review of it. Some of them still don't like the idea of doing it, and it's quite nice to be able to go back to them and say, where's your evidence for that? That's just you are working on anecdote, and actually realize that we are all, as much as we've always been entrenched in different sides of this kind of conflict, we're all people actually, and we all have our weaknesses, we all have our biases, we all have our own ideas. Actually, it was quite a nice little mini study of trying to break down some of the boundaries that have traditionally defined this kind of stuff. Yeah, God, there's just there's just so much. Aside from anything, I really enjoyed what the cameras have done. We haven't caught a huge amount of predation yet, but so much detail has come out of it. Every story has been interesting. And when I set up a oyster camera on an oystercatcher's nest towards the end of last week, I then found myself having to sort out and organize 11,000 photographs of oystercatchers sitting on their nest, which has been quite a handful. But what's been really cool about it is I get to see, and the same with the golden plover as well, you get to see changeover at the nest. You get to see really secretive, intimate moments with some of these birds. And fine, you could say it's not necessarily hugely scientific, and you could say it's not really taking us forward, but at the same time, it's a really cool way of reconnecting with the fact that we really care about these birds. I saw something the other day that made me laugh. A poem which was sort of arguing with itself in the most, let's say, the most sort of pretentious way to say, why are predators just so much more beautiful than prey? And there was all these sort of questions. And is it because of the talons? And is it because of the power of the? I thought, no, they're not. And part of me was like, well, we actually have this kind of thing that eagles are amazing, and what about a wolf, and what about like exciting sort of charismatic fauna? To me, nothing is cooler than a lapwing. Nothing is cooler than a curlew. So it's this really kind of weird dynamic sometimes where you're almost, when you stand up for ground nesting birds, black grouse, when you stand up for ground nesting birds, you're almost starting on the back foot. You're almost having to convince people, yeah, okay, I'm sorry, it hasn't got really sharp, pointy teeth, or yeah, I'm sorry, it's not going to carry away your baby, but it, like, trust me, it's really cool. It's really exciting. And to me, my friends, I have friends in university, and I love firing. I get so into this that I kind of get blinded to it. I love firing photographs to my friends in Glasgow who don't know anything about this. I got really down a few years ago about raptor persecution, and I sent a couple of articles to a friend in Glasgow and said, "Look, this is really getting me down. What?" And he came back and just said, "Hen Harrier is a bit of a stupid name." And I thought, oh, thank God, that's just an external perspective that just puts everything. This guy doesn't. My friend doesn't even know what a hen harrier is. I sent him a photograph of a lapwing the other day, and he said, "Those birds live in Scotland." And I was like, "Yeah, they do." But it really helps. I think this kind of conservation really does focus you in, and actually to get the blowout, to get the bigger picture, you realize that this Working for Waders project, the curlew project, the you're all working with, is the thin end of a much, much bigger problem here. And I suppose the Nest Camera project has really been so useful to me in that some of the solutions to some of these problems, some of the birds are up against it. The birds are up against it across the board in 100 different ways, whether it's being rolled or whether being slurried or whether there's recreational disturbance. I've had recreational disturbance has been another problem, people walking their dogs, and there's so much going on a very, very detailed level, a really nuanced level, that it's only when you really get into it you start to see how all these things add up. But at the same time, it's really important not to forget that for most people, this problem doesn't exist at all. This isn't on anybody's radar. So when you're starting to fret about tiny little details, it's really important to remember that big change, the change we need here, isn't going to come simply from a sluice gate on a single wader scrape, adjusting the water levels in a single location. It's going to come from us really reconnecting more fundamentally with what these birds actually are. And there's nobody, that's the one thing that always really heartens me, is when I bring people down, friends from Glasgow, friends from Edinburgh, bring them down here, and we go out and listen to snipe drumming, or we go out and listen to redshank, or listen to curlews calling first thing in the morning. Every single one of them gets it. They absolutely get it. As soon as they hear it, they completely know what it is. But until that stage, they never knew they were missing it, in a way. But at the same time, there's a sense of urgency, which I feel, which I think probably we all feel, that we need to act now. Like, this is really urgent. Things are falling through the floor today. This is an unsustainable situation. And it's difficult to channel that sometimes. It's difficult to process that sense of frustration. We need to act. We need to do something today, with this much, much bigger feeling that this ship's going to take a long time to turn around. And I really don't want to be negative about it, but at the same time, maybe I ask it more as a hypothetical. Knowing that curlews are, okay, then specifically curlews, knowing then that specifically curlews are struggling with productivity, and knowing that they crash in slow motion, the things that go wrong for curlews transpire over many years. Yeah, this is going to sound like a downer, but it's not supposed to be a downer. It's supposed to be a call to arms, as much as I'm not qualified to do anything like that. But lots of the work and care and love that's being directed to curlews at the moment isn't going to work. And I think probably that, from my perspective, has taken a long time to realize that here in Galloway, curlew habitats are knackered, absolutely knackered. And the birds that I'm dealing with we should have been doing this 15, 20 years ago. We're too late, specifically for me in Galloway. And so I've been to bits of Lancashire. I'm not qualified to comment where you sit on this thing, but from my perspective, we're too late, and this is going to get a lot worse over the next few years before we can start to turn it around. And I think probably then in that light, it starts to become a matter not necessarily of my curlews or your curlews or somebody else's oyster catchers, because it's going to start to get really depressing to be judging our conservation successes or failures based on individual cases. Because as I say, I think a lot of these places, it's too late to do it, even though it seems promising. It might be too late. We've got to almost start. We've got to commit to doing our best, and we've got to absolutely. This sounds daft. This sounds like some sort of inspirational thing from a 1990s management poster, but we can't afford to give up on this. Absolutely, this is an incredibly important battle to fight. But we need to realize it's not about our birds anymore. We're not fighting about our birds anymore. We're now fighting about whether we want any curlews anywhere. And I think when you start to zoom out a little bit and realize what's required here, there's no more deserving cause than curlew conservation, than wader conservation, not just because of those birds, because they're iconic. Each one is iconic in its own way, but because they stand for much bigger ecosystem, the health of a much bigger ecosystem. They have such a huge human value, human tradition, human heritage to them. But this is end game. We're approaching an end game scenario here, and if we're unable to get a bigger picture here, then there won't be any curlews, not just here or there, or there won't be anywhere. And I suppose that's been a really big eye-opener to me, is to double down and really focus on some of this detail. And it's not meant as a pessimistic tone. It is meant as that call to arms. But I think probably this is a great deal more. We're all aware of I think we're all aware of how serious this is. But I think even just recently, I've been hearing stuff about, well, we didn't get any swallows. People read something on the internet about we didn't get any swallows this year. Even my parents didn't get swallows till much later than normal this year. The wheels are starting to fall off. Scary stuff is happening, not just in the future, but now. And if we can address it, it's not then a matter of addressing it with a number of little stitches. It's about reinventing the system. So that's one of the things that I'm really encouraged by from working for waders is we're not always incredibly comfortable bedfellows when you've got the Scottish Gamekeepers Association sitting at the table next to RSPB Scotland. There's a certain amount of shuffling going on and sort of shoulder barging going on. But there are some really good conversations going on. And I think this project, the project that I've been involved in, kind of represents that requisite level of game upping, if that makes sense. So I'm really keen. Aside from it, I've already talked way too much, but I'm really keen to hear more about the project, and I'm really keen to hear if there's anything that we're doing in Scotland, because it's really useful. One of the functions of this when we've Scotland, I know about the curlew recovery project in England. I sort of start to get a feeling about how it all fits, but every piece of ground is really different. So if there's anything now, if I don't know whether I'm drawing stumps too early or what, but I suppose I'm keen to hear from the other side of the coin.
Thanks very much, Patrick. Yeah, I can see actually from the sorts of kind of challenges and the summaries of your work and the issues that actually we could probably do this as a bit of a two-way conversation maybe for the next few minutes. I think that would probably work quite well. There definitely are some questions that are coming in about you as a writer, I guess, as well as specifically about curlews. But given the audience, I think I'll start with some of the more specific questions maybe about curlews, and we can have that two-way conversation. We've obviously got quite a few people here who are involved here around Morecambe Bay, but we've actually got, as I mentioned earlier, people involved in projects we have people here from Norfolk and North Wales, Pennines as well. So we can maybe I'll do my best anyway to try and field questions via the chat to you from the people who are involved. I think there are a couple of specific questions that I'll start with about predation. So you've obviously mentioned there, for you personally, was about badgers. So I'll start there, and then I'll move on to some other questions about sheep predation and things as well. So again, this is kind of a mixture of questions and observations. There was one that came up relatively early on, which was about TB, bovine TB in Scotland, and how much of an issue that is, because there have been quite a few outbreaks, certainly in South Cumbria, which can really impact on the livelihoods of the farmers, but also on the grazing regimes that are sustaining the right habitat. So can you say a little bit more about bovine TB in Galloway and how much of an issue that is?
Fortunately, it's not an issue for us. We're on the lowest category for that. I actually don't have enough cows to warrant being tested full stop. But when you see, so I'm really interested in the impact of badgers in grassland and the extent to which they can rootle and turn over soil. My neighbour here, as I say, we've got a lot of badgers. My neighbour here has got much better fields than I do down on the riverside. And when you see after he's mowed his silage that night, you put a lamp across the field, a lot of badgers on there, and then there's a lot of scuffing and a lot of turning over the next morning. There's a lot of mud going into his silage. There's a lot of all sorts of extract of badger going into his silage. We don't have TV yet, but I think if we did, or if there were comparable diseases, I think we'd have trouble. But at the same time, part of me is always a bit frustrated that it takes TB to have that conversation. I think there's lots of really useful alternative angles to talking about badgers than a disease that costs us millions and kills thousands of cows every year. But at the same time, I know that was just one question, but I feel like the window's moving a bit on badgers. And I think probably 10 years ago, I think if you said, "Hey guys, can we have a chat about badgers?" I think consensus would have been, what are you talking about? Get out of here. Whereas now I sort of have a feel to say, if you put your hand up and said, "We don't need to look at badgers, there's no problem here," I think that would get the same reaction. I think that'd be, "Whoa, no, we really do." I feel like we're not having practical conversations about badgers yet, but I feel like that window is opening up. I think people are getting a much better understanding of what's actually happening, what's going on.
Yeah. Thank you. The next, it's not really a question, it's more an observation. Comment here. The best places I've been to with lots of waders, and including successfully fledged waders, have been in by land adjacent to grouse moors, i.e. decent habitat where there is predator control. So you mentioned a little bit earlier on about black grouse. So have you got any experiences or observations around the link between managed grouse moors and wader habitat around the edges? I mean, I certainly drove last week across Bowland and noticed good numbers of lapwings around the edge of grouse moors.
So I don't know, it's really interesting. A lot of these kind of moorland or marginal habitats for waders aren't actually that good for waders. And when you look at, every piece of ground's different. Every piece of ground's got a different soil content, it's got different pros and cons to all of it. Some ground's really, really productive. There are very few species which specifically do really well on poor ground that couldn't be, if you translocated them to better ground, they wouldn't do better. I think traditionally, particularly with lapwings, but also with curlews, has been that they did so incredibly well on the low ground, on the richer, more productive kind of ground, that they almost overspilled into the uplands. And now they're being protected in the uplands by gamekeepers, but to a level and to an extent of input, predator management, that's quite intensive. And it's one of the things too, when I've done lots of advisory work, people say, people on hill ground will say, we're not doing anything differently, but suddenly all our lapwings have gone. And you have to start piecing this together to say, well, actually, maybe your lapwings were never really your lapwings. Maybe they were always the overspill from your neighbor, and it so turns out that your neighbor planted a forest, or your neighbor completely ramped up his grassland. So it's quite difficult. The way now that we've got satellite tags, you can see how far these birds move. Like you can change nothing. You can do everything exactly the same year after year, and one year you won't have any curlews, and it might just be because a place you've never even been to, 10 miles over the hill, has changed. And so it's really difficult. It's really difficult to kind of, it's misleading, I suppose, to focus on that kind of hill pasture, in by pasture kind of stuff as wader habitat, because I actually sometimes don't think it's very good. They're there and they're doing really well because they're being supported and it's good enough for them, but they're not booming the way they do when you see them sometimes in the lowland, when they're just chucking chicks all over the place.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Got a couple of other comments here from I just mentioned Bowland, so a couple of others. One was an observation of sheep eating curlew eggs, and then another one here, which I'll read out. Really fascinating talk, Patrick. Thank you. As a conservationist in Bowland, I didn't used to like to consider the impact of predator control. But it really does seem to have an impact. Sadly, habitat and farming changes now seem to be reducing the positives that it provides to our waders. And then it says RSPB have done amazing work here in the past.
Absolutely. I think probably just what I'd quickly add to that is, and that was one of the things that maybe I didn't make very clear in talking just now, was sitting kind of in the middle of the do, as I say, having trained as a gamekeeper, now working in some of these conservation, I kind of sit slightly in the middle, and I almost think that if you think you can do it only by predator control, you're almost as nuts as if you think you can do it without any predator control. So it's like finding that balance. And actually, I like to talk about predator control being a conservation technique rather than the conservation technique, because sometimes, I don't know, there's lots of sort of disparate tensions all pulling all over the place, but sometimes it's being pitched as, well, what you got to do is just kill your foxes. And it's like, yeah, but yeah, there's lots more. There's just lots more to it. So that's just an interesting take, which specifically touches on habitat and farming.
Yeah. A couple of other kind of, I don't know, big kind of slightly bigger questions. So one of them is about the role of the NFU. So the question is, can I ask what the NFU is saying or doing about breeding waders and working for waders? Are they supporting this project and the work?
Yeah, they are. Yeah, they are. So farmers generally have been really, really good as individuals, but organizationally, I don't think necessarily I'm, again, speaking for myself, I feel like sometimes we're picked up as a bit of greenwashing sometimes to say, oh, well, actually, we're doing great stuff because look, we're involved with working for waders. And that's not specifically any organization. That applies to shooting organizations as well. Sometimes we get picked up and we're on a surge of, look, we're working with this project. Organizationally, we get great backing from a wide range of people. In terms of individuals, we get great backing from a wide range of people. But I wouldn't, for some reason, I wouldn't ask about specifically NFU, because I wouldn't necessarily say, like, there's loads of farming organizations. So I wouldn't, the fact that NFU, so the short answer is yes, NFU have been pretty helpful. But the longer answer is NFU is only actually a surprisingly small number of farmers in Scotland.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'll out myself here actually, because my day job, I volunteer with Morecambe Bay Partnership as chair. My day job, I work for Lancashire Wildlife Trust, and this is a link to the next question. And one of the things which the Wildlife Trust is sort of in the process of not necessarily repositioning ourselves around, but focusing a lot more on is nature recovery. So almost making the shift from conserving habitats to creating new and restoring habitats in places that have been degraded. So almost taking your kind of mega farming and then seeing what can be done to get it back in the other direction. And there was a question that came up on the chat about, your your book is subtitled "Life in a Vanishing Landscape," and a lot of your talk that you gave was about loss and change from a kind of traditional upland farming model towards modern intensive dairying. Have you come across any projects in Scotland which are actually bringing about nature recovery from degraded landscapes back into places that maybe can be sustaining waders?
I don't know. I find it difficult to answer your question. I find it difficult to know what hat to answer your question from. So Scotland wide, there's loads of really, really good projects going on. Some of them about specifically encouraging farmers to basically chill out and stop fretting over every square inch of their ground. And maybe if a bit wants to be wet, maybe just nudge it towards being a pond. Or if a bit is inherently difficult to work with, why don't you put some trees on it? Or so just basically trying to slacken the reins, trying to wind that back a little bit, that constant urge to intensify. So yeah, lots of what you say there chimes. I think here in Galloway, we're on a very different path. And given that we are quite obscure, rather sort of tucked away corner, when you see the targets that are proposed here in Galloway for forest creation, specifically not wildwood, not rewilding, not native broadleaves, specifically Sitka spruce. That's interesting. Actually, I spoke to somebody in the north of England the other day who said the reason why Galloway is getting so many trees is it's so hard to plant them in England. And actually, every time I go to Edinburgh, you stop at the sawmill at Lockerbie. That's a multi-million-pound industrial plant there, processing all the timber that's coming out of the southwest of Scotland, and it's going straight to the north of England. But it is to a level that, again, I had Mary Colwell very kindly came to visit me, and we climbed up onto the top of my piece of hill ground, and from there we're surrounded almost without interruption by 50 square miles of commercial forestry. And Mary said, if you didn't see this, you wouldn't believe it. And in a way, I'd almost encourage people to take a drive through parts of Galloway. It defies imagination. I'm not overdoing it. It defies imagination. So where that leaves wildlife, I'm really not sure. I really don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'm gonna just. There are a couple of questions that have come in that, again, are quite big questions, but I'm going to, given the time, I'm going to just move away from those. We may come back to them at the end if there's time. But I'm going to ask you just a couple of more kind of, I don't know, like sort of personal questions, I guess. So one of them is wants to know what, this is amazing, kind of everything you're talking about. What's your next move, Patrick? So for you personally, the questioner then wrote literally, as if actually this is our moving house or something. But well, what's kind of what's next for you? Either as a conservationist or as a writer.
Just for the sake of brevity, I've tried to not be a writer for the sake of this talk, but yeah. I don't know. It's very difficult to, when we talk about moving literally, it's very difficult for me to ever imagine leaving Galloway, but at the same time, it's very difficult to stay here, given that a lot of the issues and the wildlife that I'm really, really invested in is just absolutely vanishing. So yeah, I don't know. I would maybe like to hear how I answer this question in 5 years' time, because obviously if you're settled into a farm and you've got cattle or cows about to start calving, and it's very difficult. I was going to say it's very difficult to imagine moving. It's not. Yeah. I have no plans to move geographically, but in terms of what that means for my work, I don't know. I have this horrible feeling that, and I start to feel it happening, that the way government's starting to direct conservation investment in Scotland, it's very zonal. And actually, there's going to come a stage quite soon where we say, do you know what? Draw a line under trying to conserve waders in this place, because it's just not worth. We're not getting any value for money on that. We're only going to conserve waders now in this place or that place. And so when things start to get quite zonal, if it turns out you love curlews and yet you live 300 miles away from the curlew zone, that's pretty galling.
And then a couple of linked questions as well, following on from that. So have you got sort of any ambitions to write up specifically the the conservation side of what you've been doing? You know, are you potentially the, I don't know, the mouthpiece for the Working for Waders project? Could you be using your writing skills to be promoting that a little bit more? And then someone else has raised a question here, which is that actually drawing attention to the subject of ground nesting birds as a kind of wider issue, maybe, you know, like marine plastic, kind of really raising that the awareness is really difficult compared with, you know, say, you know, polar bears or what have you. So, you know, how do we raise the profile of this subject? So, you know, how do we, and do you, maybe, are you key? Are you a key person in doing that?
I don't think I'm key at all, largely because I am the least authoritative person probably in this meeting, and that everything I know has been just drawn from sitting and watching. And so fine details of understanding actually how any of this works, quite often I'll go into a meeting and I get absolutely schooled. I want to just completely spend an hour listening to some specialist, somebody who really knows every fine detail. Just because that's not really the way my brain works. I have a very almost sort of childish approach that is just blind enthusiasm. I just work purely on blind enthusiasm with a lot of the stuff that I'm really interested in. And that doesn't always mean that I'm very well placed to drive things forward. But I think there are lots of people starting to pick up and push forward. And actually, one thing that's been quite a big consolation to me recently is we don't all need to be the flag waver, and we don't all need to be the sort of front of house. This problem is so big, it needs thousands of people doing thousands of different things. And sometimes I wonder if there's a bit of a clamoring to like be the honcho and not necessarily be the guy who's actually going out and killing foxes. So I don't know. That probably settled quite a lot in my mind about, yeah, actually I'm doing everything I can here. If there was anything more I could do, I would be doing it. And for me, it's almost about trying to get other people to join me, not go so far down my own rabbit hole that people then wonder where I've gone.
Yeah, there's some really nice comments coming in. I'm not going to get into the Prime Minister, but what I will say is that there are people here saying, you know, we need people with passion and love and care. And then Jake just writes, it's about the state of nature and humanity not being able to recognize its value. And that, you know, this gets into deep philosophical areas, doesn't it? Really, very, very cool.
Yeah, I think it does. And I suppose my biggest upset, the thing that upsets me most about this, is I think, having been on a complete downer in talking earlier, and saying, oh well, they're all knackered. I think we will save waders in this country. I think there will be waders for the future here. But my biggest sadness is that they won't just be commonplace anymore. And they won't just be something that we don't even look at. And they won't just be something that you hear without even commenting on when you're walking back from the pub in the dark.
Yeah. There'll
be an event. And that's fine, because we'll still have them, but they'll be different. And they won't be what they were when I was a kid. And that seems like a subtle difference. It seems like a silly, tiny little detail to be upset about when such grand stakes are up for grabs here. But that's how I loved waders. That's how I first got into them. Not even generally, very specifically as a teenager, walking home from the pub in the dark and having snipe drumming over the top of me. That was the start of everything. So I don't know. I would hate to think that you'd have to pay £5 to park your car to do that, and it wouldn't just come as standard in the countryside.
Yeah. Couple of other questions. I don't know. You might not be best placed to comment, but I'll put them to you anyway and see what you say. So the first one is around nature-based solutions. So I think what is interesting today is a very good day, perhaps, to be saying this. That the government is at the moment making some quite big policy announcements about the natural environment. So today we've had announcements on tree planting, which you've definitely commented on already, but also around targets for peatland restoration have come out today. And much more kind of action plans on species reintroductions. So the current government is making some really quite big noises, and admittedly none of those headlines is particularly about wet grassland or traditional meadows or breeding waders, but the policy world post Brexit, and with a government that at the moment is certainly talking a lot about a green recovery. So things are changing a lot, and potentially could be changing for the better in terms of the policy context for the work that you and other members of the farming community are doing. So do you have any comments either on kind of government agricultural or environmental policy on the one hand, or on the specific question around nature-based solutions that we talk around? So nature being used for natural flood management or mental health or carbon sequestration, those sorts of kind of bigger societal issues. It's almost kind of saving curlews, not for curlews, but because saving the habitat helps to save other, solve other issues, I guess is the question.
Sure. I think probably my initial reaction to that is, in an upland context, I've spent 15 years trying to get grouse moors specifically more interested in re-wetting and peatland restoration, and trying to kind of facilitate a move in that kind of direction. And there's so much in that I think probably the era of only sort of single purpose land use, I like to think, is on the way out. But I spent some time working with Soil Association delivering a project that was called Farming with Nature, which I think probably it was by identifying win-wins, basically working out what farmers can do which really binds into the natural environment and is constantly fighting against it. And within a few weeks of starting that role, I realized that I really had been brought up in a countryside of lose-lose. The specific example being drainage. Around here, people are absolutely obsessed with draining every tiny little patch. And all that happens is in 10 years' time, you've got to drain it again, because inherently it's a bog. There's some parts of this country, I don't care how clever you are or how much money you spend on it, you cannot drain them. So it's a lose-lose piece of work trying to do that. And all that you're doing in the meantime is losing species diversity, you're losing lapwings, you're losing So it was really interesting to find the language to hook farmers into some of that stuff, to basically say, you're costing yourself money here and you're not moving yourself forward. And even if you don't care about the natural world's going backwards as well. So to me, a lot of it is about packaging, but it's also about relationships as well. And that's one of the things that really concerns me when we look at big government policy, is some of the best changes, some of the best progress happens at a tiny scale that big policies don't touch. One of the best examples I think of all the time is I have a friend on the Isle of Man who specifically takes care of big areas of the uplands. Everybody knows him. He knows everybody. He knows where the equipment is. He knows who needs to do what, and funds, subsidy and support go through him, and he can oversee it because he's working on a manageable scale, and he's from the island and he's grown up with all the farmers. The Isle of Man is unusual because it has that specific boost in terms of scale, but I appreciate it's a costly way to do it, to have these actual people on the ground. But when you see what that fellow on the Isle of Man can do, it's extraordinary. I wish that there was a scalable model. So when we talk about, circle back to your question, we talk about these big announcements and big policy changes and big policy pushes. I suppose probably my concern is always, what does that actually look like on the ground when it's a wet day and you go into the farmer's house and have a cup of coffee with him when you're waiting for it to clear, when you're wearing a conservation hat on, or say when the conservationist comes into your house and has a cup of coffee with you because you're the farmer that day. That's where the good stuff happens, and I worry that we overlook that tiny level.
There's something quite I find it quite emotional actually listening to some of your talk, because it sounds as if enormous amounts of money are being spent, certainly in your part of Scotland, to drain the land and intensify, and then in large parts of northern England we're trying to actually pay people to stop doing and undo all the things that were done a few decades ago to do exactly what's now happening. and it doesn't all feel massively joined up.
No.
And I'm going to have a go at opening the conversation out a little bit more. I'm particularly struck by, I don't know if Jake Fines wants to say anything. So Jake's has joined us from Norfolk. Don't worry, Jake, if you don't want to. But I just wondered whether there's any of your experiences from your work in Norfolk that you want to share. I'm struck by some of your comments and questions. They feel quite similar in terms of your background as a gamekeeper, working with the NFU, working to promote, I guess what we would call nature-friendly farming or what have you on a really big scale in your county and in the county, which is also very, very famous for its wading birds.
Hi, Patrick. Wonderful speech and sort of inspirational. We need more people like you to understand how it works, to understand the integration between producing food and allowing nature to be in our landscapes. It's something I've been doing for 30 years. And I just, all the flux within agricultural support, whether north of the border in this wonderful devolved government lifestyle that we live in, and it's very different in England as it is in Scotland, as it is in Wales, and each government is taking a very different approach. But I just think there's a real opportunity here. And if I listen to the George Eustace's address talking about planting trees and all the issues, right tree, right place, right beaver, right river. So, all of these issues we have within our landscapes and trying to maintain the wonderful diversity that we have within our farm landscapes that we've kind of slightly sidelined over the past 40, 50 years. But there is a real personally, I feel there's a real optimism to deliver both food and food that is nutritious and of value, but also producing biodiversity alongside it. And whether that's curlew or whether that's butterflies or whether that's flowering plants, I think there's a real opportunity for us to offer solutions. And it's people like yourself that have mud on their boots and actually understand the processes and how it works and how the subtleties of integration of when you turn your cattle out, when you choose to cut your silage and the impacts that you have. And it's something that we've lost because previous generations understood that. And I just wonder whether in all of the aspirations of the Westminster government, do we think these are just words, or do we think these are real, tangible solutions that will deliver everything that society is requesting from land-based organizations, land occupiers, to deliver to, and I'm very conscious that the Secretary of State today said he was just wanting to halt declines rather than reverse them. And actually, do we think, I feel, if I look at what I do, and I'm very lucky to manage a significant area, but I can demonstrate change and I can reverse trends, and I've done that, but it's trying to get others to accept that. And I just wonder, Patrick, whether you feel that all is not lost. Personally, I think it's very a positive moment. And if I look at 40 years of degradation of our environments, we can do this and we can produce everything that society wishes. So, Patrick, wonderful. Please, do you think there is hope rather than, losing this iconic species, the curlew, from our landscape? Mary, I spoke to Mary last week, who was devastated. There are only 5 breeding curlews in North Wiltshire, and someone wanted to plant Sitka spruce in the middle of their breeding hefted fields. But do we think there is hope in all of this?
I think there's probably an awful lot more hope than maybe I'm letting on, and also than you see in the press and you see when we have public discussions about conservation. I think generally the level and quality of discussion we have about conservation is generally rubbish and so confrontational and so focused on the wrong people. And yeah, I'm a bit at a loss sometimes when I think probably I should be deriving great hope and inspiration from the way that these conversations play out in public. And to me, they are, rather than being hope and inspiration, they are a major part of the problem, is the way we have these conversations. It's just crap. Absolutely, it's nonsense. So yeah, I don't mean to. I maybe didn't mean to sound pessimistic, and there is lots to play for.
So do you have any words for our volunteers around Morecambe Bay then? Any kind of, I don't know, words of encouragement or words of advice maybe for those who are really, trying really, really hard to keep a curlew population here. We've had some comments about the sound. I loved it when you were talking about the drumming snipe, which is one of my all-time favorite sounds. I probably like it slightly more personally than the call of the curlew, but it's pretty much like trying to choose between your own children.
That's really controversial stuff. And the only thing I put above that would be a blackcock, but I don't know. That's all, each to their own.
Yeah, but on Friday night, we were talking about the vanishing corncrakes, and actually in some ways, the corncrake's gone from our landscape here, and we're desperately trying to prevent the curlew sounds from going the same way. So yeah, if there's any advice you can give our project volunteers here.
I wouldn't necessarily. So I'm not hugely well equipped with advice. I have gathered a little bit of what works for me, but I think probably one of the best things that somebody has said to me in the past is that I know why I'm doing this. I know why I've made the decision to devote a considerable part of my time and effort and focus and attention into this cause, because it really matters. And I don't think necessarily I can instill that if it's not there, but what I can do is probably just say that there are lots of other people pushing in this direction, because that's one thing that I felt here is quite often dislocated, and as if I'm surrounded by other people who don't care, and I start to then question, like, is there something wrong with me? Like why am I so keen on this subject? Actually, what's really cool in a situation like this, when there's lots of people who want to talk about curlews, and everybody who so seriously cares about curlews, we all have our reasons for it. And curlews are fortunate in as much as they are universally adored. But even in bad moments, when things do not seem to be going in your direction, I would just say there are lots of other people. Nobody's alone working on this, even though you're part of a project within projects within projects. We're all pulling at different pieces of this, and we're all trying to do our best.
Yeah. Thank you. And I mean, it hasn't really been a question, but it's been a bit of a thread coming through. Lots of people kind of name checking the Curlew Recovery Partnership, for instance. So as a way of bringing together different voices, different perspectives. You mentioned obviously the Working for Wages. You mentioned Curlew Country as well. So there are these sort of groups, and again, lots and lots of comments, I think. And what's come through very well tonight is that I think what we can all do perhaps is, as you say, reach out to people who are like-minded and kind of to give us the support when times are hard, but don't forget to listen to people with alternative perspectives and remain open-minded, so that farmers and conservationists, occasionally we get a bit divided, and actually let's just, if we're united by the same passion and the same interest, well, let's learn from each other, keep talking to each other, those I think your talk tonight, which, as I say, will be shared on YouTube, is a really good example of a forum where you can get different perspectives and a different approach. So thank you very much. And then I'll just finish maybe with a couple of final bits of promotion. So on the one hand, we did put the link up at the beginning, but to your blog, to your Galloway Farm blog, which is brilliant in terms of if you want to keep in touch with what Patrick's doing, on his farm and in his wider conservation work. There's some great images up there and some great descriptions of what he's doing in all weathers. So we've posted the link. It's gallowayfarm.wordpress.com is the one for that. And then we've also reposted the donate link as well. So if you have been inspired by what you've heard and you want to help to contribute towards curlew conservation here locally around Morecambe Bay, then there's a link to be able to donate to support our work. And we know that some of you have been very, very generously giving while Patrick's been talking. So thank you very much to all of you who have donated, and thank you very much, Patrick, for inspiring that as well. So yeah, it's been absolutely fantastic listening to you. Really, really inspiring.